Okay, so we're going to be looking at good clinical practice for medical devices. And we're going to compare and contrast ICH E6 R2 and ISO 14155-2020. We do know that ISO is a licensed product, so we're just sharing some highlight information, some compare and contrast. A lot of medical device companies will still use ICH E6 R2 to support their studies and one of the guiding principles of their studies, even though it's written specifically for drugs. However, it is a good scientific and ethical standard for how we conduct human participant research with an investigational product, of course, being a medical device in this case. So as we go through this, we're going to compare and contrast. We're going to see that they are complementary to one another. There's a lot of overlap within them as well, because how we approach taking care of people and making sure their rights, safety, and welfare are protected while ensuring the integrity of our data aligns along the way regardless of what investigational product type you are using. So first I wanted to ask, and you can give me a green check or put it in the chat, or a red X if no, do you as an organization have access to ISO 14155-2020? Do you have a license for it? If you're not sure, you can let me know that as well.
Okay, so they said yes. Christine, just make sure, as I mentioned previously, that your send to is all participants in the chat. That way Beth will be able to see it.
Okay, thanks. Yeah, and then I'll stop pestering you. Thanks, Sarah. All right, perfect. So you're familiar with the layout. You're familiar with that information, so we can go into more detail here. So this is me. I've been doing this for a while, had an opportunity to work both domestically and abroad, working with drugs, biologics, medical devices, doing a lot of mock inspections and preparation, qualification audits. It's important to understand that when we are looking at these requirements, so we're looking at guidelines right now, the regulatory requirements, 21 CFR 812, for example, we're going to have to follow that. 21 CFR 11, 50, 54, 56, those are all going to be requirements. It's a minimum that the FDA requires. As we layer in these other elements, they build tensile strength into the safety net we have around our data and our participants. But if we put in our protocol that we're going to follow these things, then we need to make sure that we have provided access and that we have provided training. So oftentimes we will see when we audit that sponsors, CROs will write protocols that say you're going to follow ISO 14155 without specifying the version, but ISO 14155, and then not provide that information because it's a licensed product. So we need to make sure that if we're holding folks to these things, that they have all the information they need. So that's a regulatory requirement, right? Make sure that sponsors are giving investigators all the information they need to properly conduct that study. And once we put these guidelines into our protocols, it becomes a requirement that we follow them because we have to follow our protocols. So what we're going to talk about in this course is looking at ICH and ISO as governing bodies and the purpose of those bodies. We'll look at the core principles of each document, keeping in mind that when we do get finalization on ICH E6 in R3, that our 13 principles are going to come down to 11, but they're pretty much aligned with what we see now, with some additional information and some clarity. So we'll look at similarities and key differences between the two documents and also talk about additional sources of information. I also want to highlight that there are areas within ISO that if we follow those, we might run afoul of other requirements, which we'll talk about here in a bit. Any questions before we get started? Anything specifically that you guys are focused on or interested in focusing on?